of registrants and end users for a secure and stable DNS. My name is Yeşim Sağlam, and I'm the remote participation manager for this session. Please note that this session is being recorded and is governed by the ICANN expected standards of behavior. During this session, questions or comments submitted in chat will only be read aloud if put in the proper form as I've noted in the chat. I will read questions and comments aloud during the time set by the chair or moderator of this session. Interpretation for this session will include English, French, and Spanish. Click on the interpretation icon in Zoom and select the language you will listen to during this session. If put in the proper form, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand in the Zoom room, and once the session facilitator calls upon your name, kindly unmute your microphone and take the floor. Before speaking, ensure you have selected the language you will speak from the interpretation menu. Please state your name for the record and the language you will speak if speaking a language other than English. When speaking, be sure to mute all other devices and notifications. Please speak clearly and at a reasonable pace to allow for accurate interpretation. To ensure transparency of participation in ICANN's multi-stakeholder model, we ask that you sign in to Zoom sessions using your full name, for example, a first name and last name or surname. You may be removed from the session if you do not sign in using your full name. With that, I will hand the floor over to Hadia Al-Miniawi.
Thank you so much, and welcome all to the second at-large policy session at ICANN 73. My name is Hadia Al-Miniawi. I am an at-large AFRALO member. Previously, I was ALAC AFRALO delegate to the NomCom. I was also an ALAC member. I participated in many PDPs, the most famous of which I would say is the ePDP on GTLD registration data. I'm also vice chair of the Middle East Strategy Working Group. So this session will highlight the importance of upholding the rights of registrants and interests of end users for a secure and stable internet. We shall also try to explore the importance of upholding stakeholders' rights for a secure and known future internet, and for policies that satisfy the public interest. Other possible outcomes of this session is a research paper on the topic. As for the format of the session will be composed of 3 roundtables. The first roundtable will discuss the interests of internet users. The second roundtable will discuss the rights of registrants, and the third roundtable will look into ICANN policies and how they uphold the rights of registrants and interests of users for a secure and stable internet. So let's go to our next slide, which is the first roundtable. So the first roundtable is about internet users' interests. We have 4 speakers. The bios of the speakers are linked to the agenda. However, speakers could briefly introduce themselves before speaking. Names are put in alphabetical order. So my first question goes to Leon Sanchez, and it says, according to ICANN bylaws, how do end users participate in ICANN work?
Thank you, Hadia. This is Leon Sanchez. Thank you for inviting me to share this panel with you. And the ICANN bylaws, of course, incorporate means by which end users may participate in ICANN's multi-stakeholder model. The reference that I primarily think about, and I might be biased, of course, is the at-large organization. The at-large organization, it's stated in the bylaws, and well, of course, it states that it is the home of end users, right? So through the at-large organization, through the at-large advisory committee, the interest of end users are shown and incorporated into the different activities that the ICANN community carries out. But I would say that that's not the only way that end users can participate in ICANN. Of course, there are other constituencies, other parts of the community that I would say that maybe if they are not primarily labeled, so to speak, as being formed by end users, I would say that, of course, end users also converge in those parts of the community. To give you an example, I can think of the non-commercial stakeholder group. I can think of the IPC. I can think of many other parts of the community, even the GAC. I would think that could, in some portions of its work, enable the participation of end users within the ICANN work. Now, of course, having the at-large community formed or divided into RELOs, for those who are not familiar with the at-large structure, the RELOs are the regional at-large organizations, which of course cover the 5 different regions by which ICANN is divided for regional purposes. And even more at the base of the pyramid, we have the ALSs, which are the at-large structures. So each ALS, of course, is able to reach out at a more local level to consult, of course, the views and the interests of local end users, and then just exercise that bottom-up process that pertains to the ICANN multi-stakeholder model. So from the bottom up again, these ALSs may consult the end users at their corresponding region. They then, of course, would raise these at a rail level, and then the RELOs can have dialogues between different regions, and if they think that a certain topic may merit further discussion between RELOs and, of course, the ALAC, they can do so and raise the different issues. So as you see, there is not a single channel by which end users may participate in ICANN. There are different avenues by which end users can contribute to this effort of having a secure, stable, and reliable internet and reliable domain name system. And well, I hope that this is at least a good introduction as to how end users can participate within the ICANN environment.
Thank you, Leon. So the bylaws also state ICANN ensures an open, transparent, and bottom-up multi-stakeholder policy development process that includes civil society and end users, and that works to ascertain the global public interest. So can individual users directly participate in PDPs based on this statement, and how could they do that?
Well, of course, anyone can take part of a policy development process from my point of view, right? I mean, all meetings are open, or all meetings are inclusive. Of course, there might be some membership meetings that might require you to actually be a member of some constituency to actually take part of that. But generally speaking, the PDP process is quite open. So I wouldn't see any reason why an end user couldn't feed directly into the process of any PDP process. So, and in the end, I mean, the PDP processes are in a good part thought of how they can provide a better ecosystem or a better domain name system, and the end users would be, of course, those who benefit directly from or suffer from the outcome of a PDP. So I again, I don't see why an end user wouldn't be able to feed directly into the process. And I forgot to mention one other avenue by which end users could contribute. And forgive me for going back to the first question, but of course the different programs like the fellowship program, the Next Gen program, and other programs are certainly feasible avenues and ways by which end users and other members of the community from different stakeholders can participate and feed into the different processes that are taken within the ICANN multi-stakeholder model, Hadia.
Thank you so much, Leon. And my next question is to Sarah. And it says, through at large, the capable part of the user community can submit ideas and take positions. How can we define those positions? And by defining those positions, I mean, what elements do we need to consider when defining those positions? What do we need to factor in? Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hadia, for inviting me to this panel. My name is Sarah Kiden, and I'm an ELAC member from the African Regional At-Large Organization, that's AFRALO. So in response to your question about how we can define our positions as the at-large community, when you look at the ICANN Registrant program goals focusing on rights and responsibilities of registrants, the goals actually align very well with what we do as the at-large community. So things like educating registrants about their rights and responsibilities, things like identifying and raising awareness about issues and challenges that registrants are facing, and ensuring that registrar perspectives are reflected in ICANN.org ongoing work. So the reason I say this is because we currently define policy positions through the Consolidated Policy Working Group, CPWG, that Jonathan and Olivier lead, and we have capacity building programs through the Capacity Building Working Group. The part I feel that is missing, though, is that we still have the same people contributing to defining these positions. They are pen holders, they are the same participants in various working groups and things like that. And yet, when you look at the at-large structures that Leon has just talked about, specifically, I like looking at the newsletters from all the regions. You notice that a lot of work is being done by ALSs in their region. So they are building capacity, they are creating awareness, they are partnering with global stakeholder engagement teams to deliver these programs. So why is it that we have people working on the ground, but they are not able to get their policy, they are not contributing to defining policy positions? So I have some ideas if I reflect on what I have observed. So for example, while we are doing capacity building and creating awareness, we still have a bit of work to do. And I don't think it's actually a complex task. So it's part of it is building confidence in registrants, in end users and our members, building confidence for them to know that their skills, but most importantly, their lived experiences as registrants or end users are what we actually need to define our policy positions. The other part is empowering or allowing end users to know that we don't all have to be pen holders. There are many ways you can contribute to this process. It can be something as simple as bringing your editing or proofreading skills into a policy document, or something like sharing a case study of a specific issue that happened and how you were able to solve it so that other people can learn from it. So there are many things we can do. And finally, I think I'll say that the good news is our community is willing. I don't want to name names, but we have leaders in our community that have helped, and they continue to mentor other people to build their confidence to define these policy positions. And I'm sure my colleagues have a lot more to say, so I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your answer. And I would say the necessary elements also to factor in would be the needs of the users, the values of the users. And here comes my question to Jonathan. It's about the means and tools that could help at large define internet users' interests. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hadia. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this session. I'm Jonathan Zook, and I'm the co-chair of the Consolidated Policy Working Group within the at-large. And so we're kind of responsible for establishing positions for evaluation by the ALAC and for coordinating the participation of at-large volunteers in ICANN policy development processes, such as working groups. And so the question you ask is a very important one, which is how do we go about determining the interests of internet end users? That is our remit. And it's not a simple one, because if you think about it, the silent majority among the stakeholders is these internet end users, and that silence is part of the challenge, right? And so I think that we end up taking a kind of a multi-tiered approach to attempting to identify the interests of internet end users. And so the first, and not to be overlooked, is logic, right? We all spend most of our days as individual internet users, making restaurant reservations, trying to do online banking and things of that sort. And so we all have an innate awareness of what that exercise looks like. And so we can apply some logic to what would represent the interests of individual users. What's difficult to assess sometimes, though, is a balance of interests, right? The prioritization of those interests, particularly in the context of rights, as you have in the title of the session. And you know, because rights allow for a kind of an ideological approach to determining interests, and interests per se is more pragmatic, but it requires a balance. And so that's when we have to employ some more sophisticated tools. Our most fundamental tool is our structure itself, the ability to have an open line of communication down through the RALOs and the ALSs out to their members and back up again, and have this sort of virtuous cycle, is something that is a huge potential for end user interaction on the part of the at-large community. I think it's a vehicle we have not used nearly enough and need to use much better and organize ourselves much better to use it. So there's room for growth there, but I think that's one of the most powerful tools at our disposal. Another thing that we can do is surveys, which tend to make use of that structure to get out to the people that have at least expressed interest in internet governance issues. So one such example of that was a survey we did with respect to geographic names. This is something where there's definitely a balance of interests, whether it's freedom of speech versus indigenous rights, et cetera, that make this a complicated question, and why geographic names continues to be something that's hotly debated even after the conclusion of the subsequent procedures working group final report. And it's because there's a balance of interests in place. And so we did a survey that was evangelized through our structure, but hopefully went broader than our members, and found that while there wasn't support for a complete blocking of geographic names, that there was some concern about the take-up of geographic names in an open round. We also discovered that our community was more interested in community interests than sovereign government interests, for example, another question of balance. And so that's when surveys can become very important. The problem with these type of survey is it's kind of self-selecting. We're putting a survey out through the people that have already expressed an interest, et cetera. It's not really getting to the complete unknowing individual end user for their input. And so a final tool, and the one that we're going to get to use the least, that's most expensive, most difficult, is a professionally fielded end user survey to try to understand people's interests, needs, and priorities. And so our best example of that is a pilot we have for a survey related to IDNs and what the barriers are to the uptake of IDNs. So we have a survey that's going in the field this spring, particularly in the Hindi community of India. So that's why it's very much a pilot, to understand what the demand is for internationalized domain names. Those are domain names where the entire domain name is available in a non-Roman script, such as Arabic or Chinese or Cyrillic. And so what is the demand for those things, and what has been the barrier to the uptake of the IDNs that we have now, so that if when we have a new round of applications for new TLDs and there's more IDNs, what can be done to make sure that those IDNs are successful? And so that's an example where we're really trying to delve into the interests of people that have previously not expressed any interest in internet governance, but because they've purchased a Cyrillic keyboard, for example, they might have an interest in IDNs. And so we try to reach them through a professionally fielded survey. So logic, interaction with our members, surveying through our structures, and then finally professional surveys are all tools at our disposal for trying to identify the ultimate interests of individual end users. I hope that's useful. Thanks, Hadia.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Indeed, it is useful. And I must say, I did attend some of the meetings of the related to the survey, and I think it is going. Hopefully, it's going to be a very helpful tool and a successful pilot. So my next question is to Perry, and it says, what is the importance of safeguarding internet users' interests? Why is it important to make sure internet users who would like to contribute to the development of the internet have the opportunity to do so? Perry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hadia, for inviting me, and welcome everybody. My name is Perry Esfandiari. I serve at the ALAC and at Urala, and I hold leadership and advisory positions with the APCO International, PARIO, and Atlantic Council, and I'm president at the Global Technopolitics Forum. As for the question of importance of safety and security of end users, it's no secret that now internet has become part and parcel of every aspect of our lives as an essential component, without which it's difficult to function. And also these changes has happened with a speed and a scope beyond our imagination over a very short period of time. The opportunities and threats that these innovations offer were at full display during the pandemic, where the internet allowed us to function from distance, not just as individuals, but businesses, services, production, and the whole society. Now, the Ukraine invasion is highlighting the reality of cyber war, and the potential for the splinternet is becoming real. Earlier, Brexit and the US election in 2006 demonstrated the manipulative power of AI and social media, with serious concerns about the potential impact on values, lifestyles, and on democracy itself. We know that every year cybercrime and theft results in trillions of dollars of loss at the expense of businesses and individuals, while the internet also has enabled money laundering, child porno, human trafficking, and many other problems. Yet the innovation continues. Smart and cognitive cities are appearing on the scene, and our social, commercial, political systems are becoming dependent on network of networks, with concerns over the vulnerability of our critical system and infrastructure. Meanwhile, decentralized and alternative DNS services are also emerging, which could undermine the hierarchical architecture of DNS system, with the potential for seriously disrupting the reliable functioning of the DNS and undermining its predictability and accessibility. ICANN, as the custodian of the internet, has been collaborating with the internet community to ensure responsible experimentation and innovation in advancing the internet as a useful, stable, and accessible medium of the public good. We should remember that the unprecedented internet success and growth rests on the social contract with the end users and their trust in the internet. That trust we could only gain by being at the forefront of innovation. And I mean, for the ICANN and organizations such as ICANN, by continuing collaboration and by creative governance, regulating, guiding, and directing it. And I stop on that point. Thank you, Adia.
Thank you so much, Perry. And indeed, users' freedom to innovate is important for the success of the internet. So my next question is actually to all panelists. So each one of you will take a minute to answer, please. So it says, with the understanding that rights are necessary to protect interests, is it possible / beneficial to translate internet users' interests as they relate to ICANN into rights? And so I'll give you the floor first. Leon, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, Hadia. Thank you, Sanchez. So I think we need to be careful marking or making the difference between interests and rights. I mean, I've been an internet user's right advocate for quite a long time, and I think that if I'm understanding right, the question is, should we be pushing for lawmakers to incorporate those interests related to what we do in ICANN into legislation that could translate into rights for users? And I think it's a discussion that is very interesting, but definitely not something we can exhaust in the very little time that we have today. I could give you a list of examples of how this could go right and also how this could go wrong. So again, I think we need to be careful when we compare interests with rights or try to translate users' interests into rights. To be a little bit more concrete, I can tell you that most of what we do is already regulated, right? Because the law regulates conducts; it doesn't regulate means. So that means that we have a regulation for pretty much everything we do online already. Of course, there are some areas in which the legislation needs to be adjusted to reality and to some situations that could fall outside the scope of a particular legislation. But then again, as I said, pretty much everything is already regulated. So what we do in ICANN sometimes might be push for translating what we have as rights in the outside world into a policy that can be implemented within the ICANN remit. And maybe some issues that are policy could be translated into rights sometimes. But I can think of a very recent example of how rights could break things in regard to policy in the ICANN context, and that is GDPR, right? So GDPR, I think, should be fixed so that it doesn't collide the way it has been colliding with the different topics that we are familiar with in the ICANN context. So again, we need to be careful when we talk about interest, user interest, and user rights, how we can translate them into legislation or vice versa. So I think that would be my contribution to this, Sadia.
Thank you so much, Leon. And I totally agree with you. We are just exploring this question. We don't really have time to discuss it thoroughly. And it's just the point is that interests can conflict, right? But interests can conflict and must be balanced. But rights are defined so that they do not conflict. And so maybe that's the beneficial part. So I give the floor now to Sarah. If you could
thank you, Hadi.
be really brief, like 30 seconds if possible.
Okay, thank you, Hadia. So I would say yes, though I would flip it a little bit. First, when you say rights, it feels so legal, hence it may not attract many people like what the at-large community seeks to do. So we should focus more on the community building aspect. I would say the target should be to translate, not to translate interest into rights per se, but to generate enough interest for registrants and end users to participate and contribute to these processes. And by doing this, you're literally hitting two birds with one stone, if you will. So you're protecting registrants and enabling users who want to contribute to feel confident to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And Jonathan?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was on this question. What was the question again?
With the understanding that rights are necessary to protect interests, is it possible / beneficial to translate internet users' interests as they relate to ICANN into rights?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't think I have an easy answer for it, because rights are something that are defined in a number of different ways and in a number of different fora. And I think that we sometimes conflate things too much. I think there are rights and there are interests, and there's a balance between them, because it's sometimes we're looking to protect rights at the expense of someone's interests, and other times we're looking to protect someone's interests at the expense of someone else's rights, and that's a difficult and unfortunate situation we find ourselves in sometimes. But I don't think conflating the two is necessarily a good idea.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Perry, the floor is yours, and 30 seconds, and we'll wrap up this roundtable.
Thank you, Hadia. I will be quick. Again, as everybody said, it's the beginning of the discussion. It's a much deeper debate. And I agree that interests and rights can be separated, but generally I think that not just about ICANN, but I think that internet has become such an essential part of our lives that now we need to think about rights in a much deeper manner. And just as a starting a conversation, I think from want we are moving to need, and it's become essential service. And I think we could draw interesting lessons in governance from public utility regulations. But again, this is a much vaster, deeper discussion, which we don't have time for it. It's just as an opening, I like to mention that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you. So quickly to wrap up, Leon mentioned fellows and fellowship programs that could involve internet users and allow them to participate. ICANN Bylaws explicitly mention end users' participation in the multi-stakeholder model. Jonathan also referred to a means of knowing end users' interests, which are based on logic, interaction, and surveys. In relation to rights and interests, as all our panelists said, this is a deep and non-easy discussion that basically we have no time for now. So I thank you, and I would like to quickly go to our second roundtable. If we could have the next slide, please. So registrants' rights. For this roundtable, we have 4 speakers. Again, the names are listed in alphabetical order. The bios could be found on the agenda. Speakers, of course, can briefly introduce themselves before they speak. So the first question goes to Becky, and it says, what are the rights of registrants as incorporated in ICANN's bylaws?
Thank you very much to ALAC for hosting this panel. My name is Becky Burr. I am on the ICANN board, and I think I've been involved in ICANN for just about as long as anyone has, because I was at the U.S. Department of Commerce in 1998 when ICANN first came into being. So it's obviously a long-term passion of mine. In terms of the rights of registrants that are incorporated into ICANN's bylaws, I think the very best place to start and probably to end is to look at the commitments and core values that appear in section 1.2 and 1.2 of the bylaws. These determine the manner in which ICANN makes decisions within its remit, and they reiterate the importance of preserving and enhancing the administration of the DNS for the purpose of maintaining operational stability and reliability, respecting creativity and innovation, employing open and transparent bottom-up multi-stakeholder policy decision-making, applying decisions and document policies in a fair and consistent and neutral way, and remaining accountable. Those were the commitments, and those commitments are, we've determined to be applicable in all cases and sort of not compromisable. With respect to core values that include broad participation in the process, depending on market mechanisms where feasible, striving to achieve a reasonable balance between the interests of different stakeholders while also avoiding capture, and respecting internationally recognized human rights under applicable law. And I think all of those things are intended to protect the rights of registrants as a stakeholder, as stakeholders in this ecosystem. Obviously, sometimes those are very similar to rights of other stakeholders. And while Leon mentioned fixing GDPR, I think we should acknowledge, for example, that there are some places where the confidentiality of registrant information is fully and absolutely in service of human rights. So political speech, for example, the ability to use the internet to communicate, including communicate dissent, all of those things are critical, and a measure of privacy and confidentiality for those things is absolutely a registrant right, and reflected in the ICANN bylaws as a human right. I noticed Volker is suggesting that GDPR was the fix. I knew somebody would pick up on that. So I just wanted to say that, privacy is a fundamental human right under the law that applies to a lot of registrants, and a very important right elsewhere. And so all of those things have to be balanced.
Thank you so much, Becky, for your answer. And I would like to ask you, would different registrants require different rights, or can you have like one set of rights that serves all registrants? How should this be?
Well, I mean, for example, I think that, commercial operations, on the internet are subject to various consumer protection laws and have to protect end users who are their customers in compliance with applicable law. Whereas human rights registrants, civil society enterprises are certainly not engaged in commercial activities and have different kinds of obligations. They have obligations with respect to truthfulness and the like, but probably the consumer protection issues don't arise. But I happen to think that the biggest protection for registrants is complying with the ICANN bylaws, including the commitments and core values, where we, as we develop policies, because it is the sanctity of the, that's a big word, but I didn't mean it that way, but it's the integrity of the policy development process and its adherence to those commitments and core values that will protect everyone's rights. And I do think they're flexible enough to protect everyone. I also think, of course, lots of registrants are not really participating directly in the ICANN process. And I know this is going to be controversial, but I will just put out there that registries and registrars also are very interested in protecting the rights of registrants as well. So we do have that voice as well as the kinds of voices we hear in the business constituency and the intellectual property constituency as well.
Thank you so much, Becky. And I will go to Brian now. And Brian, to what extent are those rights considered at ICANN? And I know you have a slide, I think. You have one slide.
Yes, thanks, Hadia. So I'm Brian Gutterman with ICANN.org, and thanks, Becky, for getting us going on these questions. I also saw that Milton has dropped a link to the registrant rights and responsibilities, which are part of the Registrar Accreditation Agreement, the RAA. So I can talk a little bit about that, but I just wanted to sort of echo and agree with what Becky has stated about, the way that registrant rights are part of the larger sort of ICANN bylaws and commitments and core values. So I applaud what she said there. Those same commitments and core values to talk about the multi-stakeholder policy development process, and I think it's important to remember that there's many examples of bottom-up community developed policies that actually have the protections for registrants in mind. To name a few, there's the WDRP, which is the Who Is Data Reminder Policy, which at its core just really it reminds registrants to keep their contact information up to date, which allows them to have an open dialogue, which is important with their registrar, so they know how to find each other. The ERRP is another example, the expired registration recovery policy. This policy sometimes, allows registrants to recover their domain names should they forget to renew them, depending on the situation. The transfer policy, an important policy that's being discussed right now in a PDP, actually, but this, that's the policy that allows registrants to have a choice to transfer the domain name from one registrar to another. So, within these policies, I think the registrant, the rights of registrants and protecting registrants are there. And then, of course, the RAA, this is the contract between ICANN accredited registrars and ICANN. In there are the registrant rights and responsibilities. They have been built into that agreement. And the rights include access to information for the registrant from the registrar regarding things like registering, managing, transferring, renewing, and restoring domain name registrations. So I think those are a few good examples. Again, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation from ALAC. And one of the programs I work on, the registrant program. What we do is we try and educate registrants, but another important thing is to, and I think it was Sarah in the last roundtable who brought up the registrant program. We want to sort of help foster dialogue to raise awareness about issues and challenges that registrants face. So I think this is what this panel, part of what this panel is doing. And so, I'm looking forward to listening to the perspectives of everybody and to the audience. So thank you.
Thank you again, Brian. If you could quickly tell us a little bit more about the registrant program, education program.
Sure, and I'll drop some links in the chat.
Okay, great.
But yeah, the registrant program. Our aims again, as I mentioned, are number one is to educate registrants about things like their rights and responsibilities, and the ICANN policies that impact them, which are some of the ones I just mentioned. For example, again, the WDRP, the ERRP, the transfer policy, as well as like the UDRP and the URS. Registrants have rights there when it comes to trademark disputes and such. Again, also we want to raise awareness within the community. We want to foster dialogue. We really welcome discussions like this where registrant issues and challenges can be addressed. And we always look forward to gathering feedback from all parts of the community about sort of what we can do better, things that we can work on to further educate registrants, listening to what registrars have to say about this too, about how we can help educate their customers. So that's a little bit about the program, and we'll drop some links in the chat.
Thank you, Brian. And I'll go to Yashin. I think we have a question. We'll take it quickly.
Thank you, Hadia. This is Yashim Salam speaking. So the question is from Shokri Ben Romtan. He asks, did registrants consider their rights govern their agreements signed with other actors or by ICANN bylaw?
So could we go back to the slides, and I will ask our speakers to try to respond to Shokri while also responding to the question. So now we have Milton, and it says, could you please shed light? My question to you, Milton, would be, could you please shed light on current rights protection mechanisms? And also, if you would like to respond to Shokri, please go ahead.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Loud and clear.
I am Milton Mueller. I'm with the Non-Commercial Stakeholders Group, and NCSG is Unfortunately, by default, the chief advocate of individual rights in the ICANN context, that is, we have from the beginning been concerned about the tendency for interests to override rights of individual domain name registrants. So a bit of background here, you are having what is in essence a political philosophy discussion about the nature of rights. And as an academic, I know that there are thousands of analyses of this going back a couple of centuries. I'm adopting a liberal natural rights perspective on this, which I think is pretty much in line with the fundamental constitution and the human rights instruments of international law, as well as Europe and the United States and several other nations. So rights are categorical claims. If they are fundamental rights, they are not balanced against other interests. They're like walls or barriers that say you can't sacrifice this to other people's interests. So the interesting question for us today is, as Hadia asked, how do ICANN policies affect the actual exercise of these natural rights in the context of domain names? And there are three fundamental rights that I think are constantly being negotiated. One is privacy, the other is free expression, and the third is property rights, that is to say, the ability of registrants to exercise the property right that they have in their registration. Now, we can say with great confidence that ICANN failed to protect registrant rights in privacy, and fortunately, the GDPR forced them to do so. And I don't quite understand why anybody would be calling for undoing that, but it simply is not going to happen. There are indeed third-party interests in exposing some of that private data, and that is, again, in terms of due process rights, that is a fairly easy problem to handle. You have some kind of a disclosure process, which we're trying to create, which will make sure that the people who want to disclose the private information have a legitimate interest in doing so. And we're trying to do that in the context of the EPDP, as Hadia knows well. The ICANN also did a very bad job of protecting free expression rights during the new TLD round. In effect, we had governments basically asking for the power to veto names based solely on their feeling that they didn't like the name, or they didn't like the person using the name. And this, I think, ICANN kind of muddled through in a not very satisfactory manner. But in the reforms, the accountability reforms that came along with the transition, ICANN did try to say that it would not engage in content regulation. And this is in the core values and commitments that Becky was referring to. Although again, the language was so hemmed in with qualifications that it is in danger of becoming meaningless. Now on property rights, ICANN has done a fairly good job. First of all, we do have to recognize that trademark owners have a property rights in names, and that there are uses of domain names that violate those rights. So ICANN has created the UDRP, which facilitates the enforcement of those rights, while at the same time recognizing a free expression right of domain name registrants to use names in good faith for non-commercial purposes. And then the transfer mechanisms that ICANN has in its RAA are in effect giving and strengthening the property rights of registrants to control a name and not have it taken out from under them in certain ways, or the ability to facilitate competition by keeping the name when they go from one registrar to another. So I would say Are current rights protection mechanisms adequate? I would say that they are a little bit weak in the free expression category, that in the privacy category, they are doing well, but not because of ICANN, more because of the external pressure from the European Union. And in terms of property rights, I think we're doing a pretty good job. That's all.
Thank you, Milton. Yeah, thank you, Milton. So you have highlighted three main rights: privacy, free expression, property rights. In relation to free expression, my understanding is that ICANN, or you mentioned that as well, ICANN does not get involved in content regulation. And my question to you, but I don't think we have the time for that now, but my question would be, what other rules or things does ICANN need to state in order to prove that it actually protects free expression? But I don't know. It's a big debate. I don't think we have the time for it now. So the next question, and I see Alberto. Alberto, maybe we will go to Tijani and then take your question. So Tijani, going forward, what does ICANN need? In your opinion, are current rights protection mechanisms adequate to maintain a secure and stable internet? Tijani? Tijani, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. The question to you is, in your opinion, are current rights protection mechanisms adequate to maintain a secure and stable internet? So is Tijani still with us?
Hadia, this is Ishim. 1 second, please. I'm just checking.
Okay, so maybe we can take Alberto's question now before, until we see if Tijani is still with us. Alberto, go ahead. Okay, so maybe let's go to our final question, which says, going forward, what does ICANN need to do to further enhance registrants' inclusion in ICANN work? I'll go to you, Becky.
Thank you, Hadia. This is a hard question, because it takes time and resources to participate in the ICANN model and to make voices heard. I think that the NCSG, the business constituency, and other parts of the ICANN community do ALAC because end users are also registrants, are all speaking with voices that can reflect some of the input here. But I think the discussion that we were having in the DNS abuse plenary was actually a very important place to think about registrant inclusion as we go forward. I don't, frankly, see that there will be lots and lots of registrants who participate in ICANN. We obviously do have some, just because of the resource and time demand that's related to it. But to the extent that we can make our policies and our processes open and available and easy to use remotely, that will help enhance registrant inclusion. And I think as we move back to meetings that involve a face-to-face component, and as we move back to work that involves a face-to-face component, we need to strive to ensure that we are also continuously improving the opportunities for remote access and remote participation. So I think as we go forward and we move into hybrid meetings, and by hybrid meetings, I mean not only big ICANN meetings, but smaller policy sessions and the like, that will help. And also, clear communication about what issues are on the table will also help registrants understand what's going on and understand whether they are in fact possibly affected by this and want to participate in the discussion itself.
Thank you, Becky. And I go to Brian.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts? Yeah.
Thank you, Hadia. Yeah, and I'll be quick. I know that we have the next roundtable. There's, while acknowledging, of course, and agreeing to the general sort of roadblocks and challenges that we all face, to participate, actively within the community. I think, ICANN.org always welcomes, and we recognize registrants as essential parts of the ecosystem and of the multi-stakeholder model, and registrants, domain name holders, and when I say this is, prospective domain name holders, current domain name holders, former domain name holders, can always engage and provide their perspectives by, joining policy processes at ICANN, participating in public comments, attending ICANN meetings, of course, and joining policy development work to provide the perspectives of real registrants in those processes. And speaking on behalf of ICANN.org, we always welcome feedback on this question. I look forward to others' thoughts about how we can have more registrant participation at ICANN, and we're always striving to improve this. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Milton, any thoughts?
I would just say that I'm a little bit, you're talking about the registrant inclusion, is that right?
Yeah, enhancing.
Yeah, so again, coming at this from the standpoint of somebody who studies political and economic processes, Becky is unfortunately right. An individual domain name registrant's economic stake in the domain name policymaking process is very small. Usually it makes, they have one or two domains, maybe they have a bunch of domains, but fundamentally their investment is in the thousands of dollars, whereas committing the time to participate like crazy people like me and Hadia do in an EDPP over a period of years and spending 3 or 4 hours a week or more, that is a cost commitment that most domain name registrants are simply not going to make. So we do need to keep the doors open. We need to have the constituencies and stakeholder groups out there actively recruiting stakeholders, but fundamentally any expectation that you're going to get mass participation in ICANN processes would be unrealistic.
Thank you so much, Milton. So registrants' rights are incorporated in ICANN's bylaws, Article 1.2, commitments and values. Registrants' inclusion or enhancing registrants' inclusion is not an easy task. Their stakes are small. However, remote participation, keeping the door open for them, and inviting registrants to be part of this should be a continuous task. And then pointing out to specific rights, Milton talked about privacy, free expression, and property rights. Now let's go to the third round table. And yeah, so the third round table, this is about ICANN policies and how these policies uphold rights of registrants and interests of end users. So the first question would be, we have three speakers. Names are listed in alphabetical order. The bios are linked to the agenda. And speakers could definitely introduce themselves, briefly introduce themselves before they speak. So the first question goes to Holly, and it says, please pick any ICANN policy that has either concluded or is still under development, and discuss how the policy upholds the interests of users and registrants and the impact of this on the DNS ecosystem. Holly, the floor is yours, and I believe you have a few slides.
Yes, I do. Thank you. While we're waiting for my slides, it's Holly
There they
Race
are.
from. Thank you. Thank you, Hadia. The policy that I have chosen to look at in terms of protecting, and I'm very careful to use the term interests here. I'm talking about interests that become rights to the extent that those interests are incorporated in a code which can be enforceable. So we'll talk about interests, please. I'm looking particularly at the transfer policy. Now, there are many aspects to the transfer, which I don't have time to discuss. I'm looking particularly at a transfer between a registrant and a register. First question I ask myself, or we are being asked to think about, is what are in fact those interests? And I've identified, I think, three interests that may or may not be enforceable. The first, from a registrant point of view, that would be the holder of a registered domain name, would be choice. And that is the ability to move from one registrar to another for whatever reason, price, service, however, whatever you want for a reason, you move. But in the process of moving, the actual process to be used confirms two things. Number one, that you are the requester, that you are entitled to make the request, that you are moving to a registrar that you want to move to and not somewhere else. I'm going to talk a little bit about that process just to illustrate how a process tries to protect that interest. The interest from an end user perspective is really about security. And that is that, in fact, if you go to your trusted domain name, joesmithtools.co.au, whatever, that's where you wind up, and you're not at a fraudulent site or a criminal site. Post GDPR, there is another, and I will use the term interest because in this context, it is whether or not it's enforceable. It would be the right of a registrant to protect the privacy of their data, such that it's no longer on a publicly available WHOIS database as it used to be. Okay, the next slide, please. In explaining how those interests are incorporated into a rule, a policy, there are two terms. One is auth info code. This is the code that is given by a registrar to the registrant to say you are in fact the person that's entitled to that name. And it is used to identify that registrant. The next is the form of authorization, the FOA, and this has been used to confirm that in fact a request has been made of that requester. And those are the if you will, the safeguards put in place so that the interests of the parties that I've identified will happen. Now, prior to the GDPR, part of the process meant that the gaining registrar, the registrar that I have gone to and said, I would like your service, please, I'd like to move to your service, the gaining registrar actually used a form of authorization, form of authorization to say, okay, I'm just confirming this. I'll go through the process. It's a very complicated one. I've tried to make it very simple and maybe made it too simple. But post GDPR, we lose some of that ability. So this is a how is it that the interests that I've identified are nevertheless still preserved. So could I go to the next slide, please? Okay, I'm sorry, you can't read this. The slide should have been bigger, but never mind. On the left, you've got the process that was put in place probably around 10 years ago to identify or to make sure that the interests that I identified are carried through, and that is that the registrant is in fact the person requesting. They go to the registrar they are requesting to go to, and that the losing registrar is identified. So what the process on the left is how these interests were protected. So starting from the top, the registrar goes to the registrant goes to the gaining registrar and says, I want your service. What used to happen was the gaining registrar would then go to the WHOIS database, check on the bona fides. Yep, that's the person. Yep, they actually have that name. Okay, fine. I'll get back to this registrar and say, okay, I'm confirming your request. Then the gaining registrar notifies the registry, and the registry then says, okay, going to send notices to two people. First of all, I'd like to send a notice back to, and we're now at point 5, the notice of pending transfer to both registrars, the gaining and the losing, to say, I've had a check. This is all above board. The person says they are who they are, and I'm going to transfer. The losing registrar then realizes, oh my gosh, I've just lost a customer. And then the losing registrar says to the registrant, so you really do want to transfer, don't you? Okay. Registrant says, yes, I do. Transfer complete. And it's achieved two things. It's achieved the ability to transfer. It's achieved the ability to transfer in ways that guarantee, insofar as possible, that the person who wanted to transfer has been able to do so in a way that confirms their identity, the identity of the gaining and losing registrar, and the interests of the end user, insofar as it's been a secure transfer, also have their interests upheld. Post GDPR, it's slightly different, and what has had to be crafted is a way to continue the security of that transfer and the security of knowing that the person who wants to transfer goes to the place they want to go to. How do you do that when you can't check the WHOIS database? So what's been proposed in the ongoing discussion is the registered name holder, the registrant, goes to the gaining registrar. I want to transfer. The gaining registrar can no longer check who that person is. So they've got to say, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to enter your database, your data again. And you're going to have to use your auth info because we don't have now the gaining FOA.
Holly, could you please try to wrap up?
I will. This is the final, just about final slide. The final process then means that you're using the auth info code as a form of identity. You only get one losing FOA that the losing registrar says, okay, this request has been made. Are you sure you want to make it? And again, the registrant then says, either, yes, I want to make the transfer, or all of this has happened without my authorization. Stop the process. Again, the safety has been, insofar as possible, secured. But could I have the next slide, please? And it's the final slide. Could I have the next slide, please? So these are the issues from the perspective of the end user and the registrant. Is this still a safe process? Can the auth info code be considered as secure? Who should hold it? What are the minimum notification requirements to continue that the process is a genuine one? And is the final check, which is the losing FOA, goes to the registrant to say, did you really authorize this and are you okay to transfer? And if not, what can you do? And right now we're also looking at the transfer lock periods. So all of those issues that are the final questions are how now.
Thank you so much, Holly. I think we all got the idea, and transfer policy, choice, security, and privacy are definitely all important. If we could go back to the agenda, and we will, I will pose this same question to Edmund. Edmund, please try to be brief. I'm sorry for that.
Thank you, Hadia, and I will try to make up some time. And thank you, Holly, for teeing this off, really diving deeper into transfer policy. But I guess there are other policies like what Alan mentioned in the chat, and Brian from ICANN mentioned the expired registration recovery policy, the domain lifecycle, really. And I think I don't know enough about law to say whether this is right or not, the right or interest, but the policy does does determine the right of the registrants to redeem their domain if it lapses, right? I mean, that's in my sense, it's kind of a right. But I focused a little bit more on IDNs, internationalized domain names, which is a current active PDP, policy development currently happening. And focusing on, well, actually earlier, Hadia asked the question, can different registrants have different rights? Here we have a situation, maybe, again, I don't know the term right in law good enough, but I'll explain. Variance, IDN variance is a very interesting aspect, and a worse way, but an analogical way to think about it is that certain languages, unlike alphabetical based languages, which we have big letters and small capital letters and small letters in the domain name, and they work the same. But in the sense of ideographical language like Chinese, there is simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese, and they technically become different different domain names, but only through policy could we make them the same? And therefore, the registrant can actually have the right to utilize both the simplified Chinese domain name and the traditional Chinese domain name, and how this affects I think the security and stability of the internet also is the kind of trust. And when people actually use the domain names, they may be typing it in the simplified version, they may be typing in the traditional Chinese version, and they would consider them to be the same. And if they don't work the same, or if they don't work, then it dilutes the trust. And just as in terms of the numbers, actually the statistics is that 1 in 20 internet users actually use a variant TLD of the in Chinese, and that's the level of importance. And I think policy itself would determine whether the registrant would have a right to utilize its IDN variants, and also whether it would be free in some ways. And one may say, hey, why would you register one domain and get two get another one for free? You might look at it that way, but certainly it's not because the Chinese is greedy. It's because it's important to the security and stability and the trust of the domain name system for those users and for the registrants to be able to serve the end users to that. Another good example is single character TLD. It may not be very, it may not be allowed in Latin-based or alphanumeric kind of situation. But for Chinese, for example, the situation is different. A single character essentially is a word. It's a word like Asia. It's a word like a car or anything, right? And so the type of rights or the type of ways that the policy actually is put in place would affect the end registrant or the end users on how they interact with the domain name system. So, I think I just want to illustrate that that's also a reason why end users should participate. But as Milton mentioned, only crazy people like myself and others would be on that in that perspective. Of course, I also am blessed to have to also work in the industry, although some of these policies I participate as a person. So to wrap up, I think there are many different policies. IDN is one of them that I wanted to highlight, that there are components where registrants and end user rights and interests are have impact, but also other things, coming up. Also the accuracy, what is that called? Sorry for the WHOIS accuracy data group also would have certain privacy considerations as well. So many different policies would have that aspect, and I think hopefully I highlighted some of the user parts of it.
Thank you so much, Edmund, and definitely the EPDP, the IDN EPDP for GTLDs is a good example. It does show how registrants' rights affect internet users' interests, definitely, and how this policy would benefit both, hopefully. Charles, I go to you. And my question is, please provide some general thoughts on the future of registrants and internet users' interests and how they will continue to provide a secure and known future internet. And I will also give you one more question related to the public interest. And the question says, the public interest could be defined as the well-being of the public. And since ICANN's community involves all stakeholders, would taking all stakeholders' interests into consideration during the development of a process by default translate into an ICANN policy that satisfies the public interest? So Charles, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Hadia. I'm Charles Mark. I was a former AP Rallo chair, and I really want to take a higher level some higher level comments on some of the words that you mentioned in your question. You mentioned about rights. Many previous speakers have commented on that. But you also mentioned about the future internet and being secure and stable. When we think about, I think many of us were talking about some of the, what I think are more like the narrow sense of registrants' right and end users' right. I do realize that ICANN policies do have, very defined in the bylaws and so on, very defined registrants' rights and responsibilities. I guess after all, registrants are like the customers or direct contacts or having a direct or even indirect contractual relationship with ICANN. So that's understandable. But when it comes to end users, it's really not so clear. Leon mentioned in the beginning that there are ways of participation at large, RALOs and ALS and other constituents and so on. That is participation. Participation may not necessarily it can be part of the people's right, the user's right, but not everyone exercises it. I think that's exactly what Jonathan mentioned as about talking about the silent majority, and Milton talked about those people who are crazy, but what about those people who are not crazy? They deserve as much right as anybody else. So what came to my mind when I was thinking about this was, is there any build of rights for users in the ICANN process? End users of the internet, as far as ICANN policies may affect them. Their use of the internet or domain names, they may not even own any domains, but they're users, which affects things that some of the rights that, for example, like Milton mentioned about privacy, free expression, and property rights. The ways that ICANN's policies may be affecting the rights of these people. Is there a necessity to develop such a bill of rights? I'll give you one example that I have recently, actually for more than 2 or almost 3 years, that I have been looking at, is a series of doxing websites that put out a lot of personal data on a number of websites around the world, and they keep moving around when people complain about them violating local laws or whatever, or maybe GDPR, and they got shut down from one jurisdiction, and then they moved to another TLD, and they ended up in Russia. So the rights of the users in terms of their security, their privacy is obviously violated. And what about that? The bad actors here might actually be states back. So what can ICANN do? The people who are affected, first of all, some of them, they may not even know that they are affected. And even if they do, they have no idea about what rights they have in terms of trying to get these content off the internet and so on. So as a sort of not really a conclusion, but I want to point out a worry that I really believe that the situation will get increasingly geopolitical. Governments will come in and tell ICANN what to do and what TLDs needs to do. And in some cases, TLDs may listen to the government more than they would listen to ICANN, or even if they have any policies. So sometimes even in good intention, some governments may come to ICANN and ask them to do certain things, like Ukraine recently did. So what is the process that we can have to protect the users? Now, ICANN will have to be the referee, but what are the processes and the values that they are going to be basing everything on? And I just worry that it's going to get more and more complicated and political. The final question, I try to answer your additional questions as well about public interest and how we can use the. I think I think I actually addressed some of that in my previous answers, but I think in order to really protect the public interest, we need to really take a harder look at how to protect or understand the rights of those people who are not really represented or they didn't participate. Make a distinction between representation and participation. For those people, particularly that are not participating in the process, and they will not participate, or maybe they're unable to, or for many different reasons. How are we going to come up with a way that we can understand or define the kind of rights that they really should enjoy, and then set out the processes within ICANN to really enforce those rights being taken up by the registrar, the registrants, and so on. So I think that is an issue that we need to take a deeper look as the whole world gets more complicated and more political. And I'll close with that.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I will point out two things that you said. It's not only about the interests of users, but it is also about their rights in relation to security and privacy. And I think this distinction is very important. Also, talking about both registrants and users, I think, and also you said, understanding the rights of those who did not participate is also key and very important. I would put those two notes and end our session with it. We are at the top of the hour. I thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to our panelists. It was a great discussion. Thank you to all attendees. Thank you for being with us today, and see you in next time in our next policy discussion. Thank you.